So this is a disclaimer. I'm not an expert in fruits, nuts, and berries. Actually, I'm not an expert in anything anymore. As an agent, you kind of have to know a little bit about a lot of things. I do have some experience in this area. When I was in college, I worked on a peach orchard. We actually grew lots of different fruit, but we call it a peach orchard. Do you need this?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it might help.
So I'd much rather have one of our fruit specialists come and speak, but we don't have any nearby, and it's hard to get them scheduled and arranged to come up. One year I actually did them remotely, and it went well, but you know, the connection was from here to Uvalde, and do y'all know where Uvalde is? And so the connection wasn't that great, and it worked, but I'd rather everything go smoothly and not risk anything. So I choose to try to give this presentation myself. This afternoon, we have one of my colleagues, Michael Cook, speaking. He's over in the Denton County office, so he doesn't have to travel very far, but he's our viticulturalist for the region. He covers 55 counties from Abilene to Texarkana. So it's a big region. I thought I'd get on my soapbox a little bit about our agency a little bit, and I hope I don't get myself in trouble. But I think it's good for our volunteers to know some of the limitations that Extension has. Over the years, we've lost positions. And so one of our directors was giving a presentation years ago and talked about how since the 1970s, we've been losing funding for the Extension Service at the state level and really have not gained those funds back. And every time we lose funds, we lose people. And so it's been a challenge for the agency to stay on top of things, to have staff to meet the needs of the citizens of Texas. The primary reason for bringing this up is that it's through citizens like yourselves being vocal about supporting Extension with your elected officials. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. I try to meet with elected officials. I do monthly reports for elected officials so they know the good work we're doing and can continue to support our efforts. We actually have 3 fruit specialists. One's in College Station, one's in Uvalde, and one is in Fredericksburg. And so they have to cover a lot of different crops, as you'll see. The different fruit and nut crops that we can grow in Texas is quite varied, and so it's difficult to do research on all these different things. And then speaking of research, we have our AgriLife Research Agency that also has limitations as well in conducting research on fruit. Trying to think of maybe 1 or 2 fruit specialists. Obviously, we have one down in West Laco, which is where in the Rio Grande River Valley, and they primarily focus on citrus. And then we have one in College Station who's a breeder who breeds fruit trees, but he also breeds roses. His name is Dave Byrne, and as you can imagine, Rose Rosette has become a large issue around the country, especially here in Texas, and so he's spent a lot of his time breeding roses. On November 12th, we have an educational program on Rose Rosette. It'll be at Chambersville Tree Farm. Y'all familiar with Chambersville Tree Farm? It's just right over here, a few miles away. If you take 543 Western Road off 75 and head north, you'll come to a new neighborhood, and there's a stop sign. Just keep heading north, and the road curves around, and you'll see Chambersville Tree Farm. You can search for it on the internet too. It's a quite large facility. It's a tree farm, but they also have a massive rose garden that they've been building over the last 10 years. And so they have been very supportive of research on rose rosette. And we're having a national meeting of the researchers on a national grant on the 11th, the 10th, 11th, and then we're doing a public meeting on the 12th. So y'all are invited to attend. There should be something on the e-minders about it. Hopefully, if it's not up already, it will be soon. So I encourage you to attend that. But you can see that I'm already rambling, but it's good information. So let's get started. Here's some definitions. I'm not going to read these. These are very boring. But these are the botanical definitions of fruits, berries, and nuts. And so I wouldn't worry about writing this down. I have uploaded these to the Dropbox, and they won't be on the quiz. I wouldn't want you to have to write that and fill in the blank definition. But it's important to note that the term fruit is not always synonymous with food preparation or culinary arts. So when we call things a fruit and a vegetable, those things aren't always very simple, because there's a lot of vegetables that are actually botanically fruit. And we have different names for fruits, and here are some: pepo, Hesperidium, a false berry, aggregate fruit, multiple fruit, accessory fruit. So, if you want to get real technical with your friends and family, you can start calling, well, that's a Hesperidium. They might be impressed. So, we have Thanksgiving coming up, so you might have some fruit on the table and you can use some of these terms. I've worn my family out with those kind of things, so they're not as impressed as they used to be. So berry is the most common type of fleshy fruit. And even a tomato is actually a berry. So avocado, eggplant, chili pepper. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? What's not a botanical berry, but they call it a berry? A blueberry is not a berry. Blackberry is not a berry, it's an aggregate fruit. Strawberry is accessory fruit. Nuts. So there's lots of different nuts. We tend to think of them as tree nuts. There is the peanut, which is not probably really a true nut. It's a pea. So, and we have different. When we look at the fruit or nuts on a tree, they're going to be covered, and then when they're ready to harvest, those coverings open up and release the nut, and then the fruit or the edible portions inside. So I put this slide up. You've probably seen this picture before. Raise your hand if you remember it from a previous presentation. But the whole concept of this is to recognize that we have to have that sunlight to produce chemical energy in the form of sugars to be stored in that fruit. So, if we don't have sunlight or if we don't have photosynthesis take place, we're not going to be able to produce that fruit. So the overall health of the tree or plant is very important. As you can imagine, the overall site selection for your fruit trees is important, because you got to provide all those necessary things for the plant to undergo photosynthesis. We have to have proper site to where it gets enough sunlight. So fruit trees, you don't want to plant under a shade tree, obviously. You don't want to plant too close to a structure that may shade that tree. We'll spend some more time talking about those things. So it's, as with any garden, we need to properly plan the site, and those are the things I've just been talking about. So the what, when, and where. And when we start talking about trees, we got to provide space. So our average home, quarter-acre lot in a residential neighborhood is going to be very limiting on fruit trees. Just recognize that. There are some tricks that we can use. Variety selections that are dwarf varieties. There's some rootstocks that help dwarf the plant that we can utilize to try to fit into the space that we have available. Pruning also. Pruning and training systems. Obviously, if you have acres to work with, then you have a lot more options. Yes?
If you were out shopping for a new home and you were thinking that you'd like to have maybe not a whole massive orchard, but a handful of fruit trees, mostly for culinary purposes.
Yes.
And so you were evaluating, did you have the right amount of sun conditions? But is there any rule of thumb for what you would say is the amount of acreage you'd try to target for your fruit trees?
So the question was, what was a target number of acres if you wanted a respectable size orchard? A good acre or two is probably a minimum.
Okay.
If you want something of substantial size, but you'll see in a picture later in the presentation, one peach tree can produce 3 to 4 boxes or bushels of peaches in a good year at maturity. So, that may be enough for you. So it all depends on your goal. Certainly there's a variety of fruits that you may want to have access to, so having those varieties, but a lot of those fruit trees are going to need a pollinator, so you need at least 2 trees. So that's something to consider when you think about what you're going to plant, because you need to have more than 1 tree. So, my backyard probably couldn't even support 1 tree. It's just not the way it is. The way I have it designed, there's no way I have enough space. Now my neighbor behind me, and he's had peach trees, but actually the original owner planted 2 peach trees in the back and didn't properly prune them. One of them died, and so there's 1 left, and it still gets pollinated from bees transporting that pollen from another peach tree in the neighborhood, I guess. But there's other issues that I'll talk about my neighbor later. So, so
Thank you.
sure. So site selection is really important. Fruit trees are not going to tolerate wet feet, as we say. You need good drainage. So don't plant a peach tree in a low spot on the property. It needs to be up high. It doesn't need to be standing water. You need to check the infiltration rate of the soil. So you dig a hole and then fill it up with water and then see how long it takes to drain that hole. And so that's a typical percolation test, as some people call it. So the rule of thumb is generally if you want that water all to be drained within 24 to 48 hours. That seems like a long time to me. I would want it kind of drained faster than that. But with our soil, that's a challenge because the heavy clay soil has those tight air spaces. Do y'all recall that from soil science class. So it's not going to drain that fast. But you don't want to have like a hard pan or some type of rock that's below that area where you're planting that's going to limit the drainage. And, pecan trees may be an exception to that. You still want good drainage, but pecan trees could be planted in a floodplain. And actually our native pecans that we typically see are near creeks, in floodplains, and they can tolerate prolonged periods of time when the soil's saturated. So let's see. Water. So water is important. Quality of water is important. Having access to water. If you're putting in an orchard, you need an irrigation system. You don't want to rely just on rainfall because that rain's not going to come when you need to be providing water for that crop to be productive. So, oftentimes you need to really have that irrigation system already installed, ready to go, before you even consider planting. So now a lot of what I talk about today, I'm going to try to cover that home orchard as well as a full-blown orchard. Does that make sense? So there's going to be times when you talk about irrigation, if it's in your backyard, you could get away with just hand watering it on a regular basis. But if you're doing an orchard, you're really going to need to have an irrigation system because it's not always practical to hand water all those. Some people still try. But, time can be a limiting factor, so some people don't have the time to go out there and hand water all of them. They may not have the containers to fill up big enough to water all these trees. So soil testing, I kind of mentioned the percolation test, so checking that out is important, but also just general soil tests. If you have poor quality soil, it may be better to find a better site that has better soil. When I say what's good and bad soil around here, I tend to mean, is it topsoil or is it that underlying clay that we seem to see more frequently around here because of developers scraping our topsoil off. Consider the type of fruit, varieties, chill hours, cross-pollination. We'll get into some of this later. So space is really important. Determine what you want to grow and how much space that requires. We have a lot of reference material on fruit trees, what size. Typically it's not height that you're worried about, it's more width. And, obviously trees that are left unpruned are going to get large, but within the pruning and training systems that we use, what size would that plant be? And so you can determine kind of what space you need to provide to that plant. I know I was briefly looking over the handbook that y'all have, and there's a lot of information in there, a lot of reference material. I'm not sure, maybe I should ask, how many people read the chapter on fruits? Be honest. Well, there's quite a few. So y'all probably already know everything, and you have to, right? It's homework. But there's a lot of reference material, so I'm sure you picked up on some important things for the. Yeah, and I would say that a lot of our specialists try to start off by discouraging you. So a lot of them, they want you to know the challenges up front, because if you think it's all going to be sunshine and rainbows, then you're going to be rudely awakened by the problems that you face. A lot of those are diseases, insects, environment. Late freezes are probably our biggest issue with our common fruit trees, especially peaches. So those are things to consider. Trying to do some of these crops organically is a challenge. There's even we do have a publication on, it's a kind of older publication, but it's still quite relevant, is the challenges or what crops, fruit and nut crops that could be grown organically with success. So, so it kind of gives a relative rating of whether, like a peach tree, is going to be very difficult to grow organically. Now, how do organic growers do it? Well, they try their best, but with any disease or insect problem, they're going to have a percentage of loss associated with the crop. And so, so you're paying a premium because there's less fruit available because they've lost from insect or disease damage. So, you know, we continue to, well, I'd say we, others continue to try to research and find ways to control those diseases naturally, or insects naturally, but there's challenges associated with that, limitations. Let's see. So space requirements, I continue to reiterate space. You know, when you go plant a new fruit tree, they're small, and it's hard to visualize the space required, and some people may mistakenly plant them too close together. And when you have plants that compete for resources, they're not going to be as successful. And so we want to provide space. Obviously, in a suburban landscape, you have limited space, so there's it's important to be realistic. In a suburban area, pest control can be somewhat intense for these type fruit trees, and so is that going to be workable in your neighborhood, where you're out there spraying a fruit tree with your neighbors, you know, 5 feet away? You know, they may have a problem with that. And it's probably pretty easy for them to make a complaint on you and you get in trouble. Because if you're spraying a fruit tree, or any type of tree, frankly, you're gonna have to be spraying up. And what typically happens when you spray up into the air? It kind of drifts and then comes down somewhere else, right? And your neighbors do have the right to make a complaint, and you could be fined. Just want to warn you on that. So when we have clients that call into the office on issues like this, I always warn them. I said, you know, here is the option you have to control this particular disease or insect, but you have to keep in mind, if you're in a neighborhood, you're spraying this tree and it's hanging over your fence, you know, and you're spraying it, and that's your neighbor's property over there, and they may not want you to spray stuff. So anyhow, you can imagine the limitations on that. So here's a pecan tree. So pecan trees are going to be very large in comparison to a peach tree, require a lot more space, and you have power lines to deal with. So there's this power line you can see here, and this tree's relatively young, and that tree is going to be in that power line before too long. So that is something that you don't want to do. Really, any tree. You know, pecan tree is the state tree of Texas, and it's native to Texas, native to the southeast. Texas is the largest producer of pecans, second to Georgia. I don't know if y'all knew all those. You didn't know that? Yeah. How many people are sort of consider themselves from Texas? Okay. I consider myself from Texas, even though I wasn't born in Texas. My family's from Texas.
Did you say that Texas was the largest producer of pecans or second to Georgia? Which did you say?
I'm sorry. Yeah, that second statement confused you. So, yes, Texas is the largest producer of pecans. Yes.
And second is Georgia.
Second is Georgia. Yeah. And actually, if you look at the statistics, Texas and Georgia go back and forth. And I could be wrong. Maybe it's North Carolina. So I think maybe it's North Carolina. So anybody from North Carolina? No. But they go back and forth. And so one year, Georgia, we'll just say Georgia, maybe North Carolina. But they'll go back and forth. So why do you think that one state has, one year will have more production and it's pretty routine? Anyone guess? Weather, that's part of it. Pollinators. There's something about pecans that's naturally, it's every other year. It's called alternate bearing. So that's pretty important, so you might write that down. Why is, and it's not even on the slide, and I don't think I even mentioned it, so I'm mentioning it now. So alternate bearing is where the tree will produce a bumper crop one year. I heard that term, bumper crop, and then the next year it doesn't. It may have slim to none the next year, and that's natural. Why is that the case? Well, pecans are produced in the fall, and the buds for next year are also formed in the fall. And so if it's carrying a heavy load of pecans on that tree, and then it's also producing these buds that have the flowers in there. So those buds, basically all the cells are formed for the flowers for the next year in the fall. Isn't that pretty cool? The grapes are the same way too. So microscopic leaves and flowers and everything are in those buds. And then in the spring, when those buds break and the growth starts to occur, those cells were already formed the previous year, and water is just filling those cells, and they enlarge and grow. So if it's carrying a heavy load, those flowers are not going to form with as many potential fruit or nuts on them. So that's why the following year is not going to be as productive. However, if you have a large orchard, you're going to try to thin so you can even out your crop so during the summer, there's a particular time when you do it. July? Oh, yeah. Forgot, we have a pecan producer back here. So in July, we're going to thin the trees. One way to do that is shaking it. So there's a machine that shakes the tree, and it causes a certain percentage of the fruit to fall off, so that you produce, you're more even in your production year after year, instead of having these ups and downs. So economically, that's better for you because you get paid every year instead of every other year. And the environment can play a role too. So if we have, and probably naturally plays a bigger role in our native pecans. So 50% of our production in Texas is actually native pecans, and then 50% is improved. And if we have a drought, then that tree's not going to support the fruit production, and it's not going to set as much fruit, and then therefore the following year, assuming we have the rainfall, it produces more. So during our drought years from 2011 to 2015 or 14, we didn't have enough rainfall to really support. But once we had some rain, we had a bumper crop. So, but if those producers were in an agriculture situation, if they didn't thin, they're going to not have as much production this year. So let's say that you have poor soil or poor site, but you have the space. You can improve drainage, you can improve by building a raised bed just like we would in a vegetable garden. And so in the top picture we have a box for a peach tree. Obviously this looks like a large box right now, but as that tree gets larger, it's going to look pretty small. But at least the tree gets off to a good start, and you have a better chance of success. Last year, I know there's a lot of people that lost their peach trees just because of all the rain. When you have a box like this, you're going to increase your chance that that tree is going to survive. Here's a raised bed for some blackberries, so another option. Yeah, so right here, so use some soil amendments in that raised bed. So you could amend your existing soil and build that bed with compost and expanded shell. Or you can bring in, your own soil mix to plant that in. So in this picture, that's sand right there. I wouldn't do that in our soil, but in this particular picture, it's that sand works. I would use a compost blend of some sort. So around here. So as I mentioned, it can be, for home fruit production, be very demanding, but satisfying. Determine what you can grow in your climate. Make sure you use the recommended varieties. Use proper management techniques, fertilizing, pruning, irrigation, etc. Disease prevention and control, and then harvesting. So what can we grow in Texas? So here's a list. Now, Texas is a big state with lots of different soil types, lots of climates, so this isn't a fair list. So there are certain things that we can grow here, and people tried to push the limits, even though it's not on this list. I'll use it as an example. So there are people trying to grow olives in Texas. Has anyone heard of the olive production that's been going? So, yeah, there's olive oil. I think at our garden show, we had someone selling some of the Texas olive oil. It's down south, so we can't grow olives up here. I know there's people who want to grow olives, but we get too cold, and they won't. They'll die down to the ground each winter, and then they'll have to produce a whole new tree. So it's just not conducive for production. But down south of, say, Interstate 10, you have some options. Further south, the better. But it does take what we call a Mediterranean climate. So around the Mediterranean, there's a lot of olive production. And we really don't have a Mediterranean climate in Texas. So, but we have a lot of people, I say a lot of wealthy people trying to grow olives. So if it was just an average farmer trying to grow olives, they would have already quit. And I hate to be critical of somebody, but they're pushing the limits because they have financial resources to take those losses year after year as they learn. Those people have been quite vocal as well in gaining support from Extension So several of our fruit specialists are actually working with those producers. They've started a breeding program, a variety selection program, and evaluating varieties for success here in Texas. So we're not doing that in North Texas though. That's all South Texas. So don't get any crazy ideas. They did give the agents all a olive tree one year at our annual retreat and said, take this home and plant it and see what happens. And it stayed this little stick for several years. It's just this little stick in the ground. Never really did anything. So that was my experience. I don't want y'all to share that same experience. There are some things like jujubes that can be grown around here. Yes. What?
It's actually jujubes.
Jujubes?
Yeah, I know, like,
Okay.
the only producer in this whole area.
You're the only producer.
No, I know the only producer.
Oh,
We go and pick jujubes from him every
okay. Jujubes.
It's jujubes.
So it's a Chinese date, is what it is. Now, is he over kind of west or north of Farmersville? Yeah,
Jacobson?
I think I've met him.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. There's a public site where you can see these, and they're probably on the tree now, I think. Have they been picked yet?
Yeah, picking is done.
Done, okay.
It's not a good year because they really do favor the dry weather, and this is the first year, we usually get, bushels full, and my husband freezes them and hands them over
Okay.
to Ron, but this year, we just got, I don't know, very little.
Okay.
We just had a bad year because it was too wet.
Well, at Chestnut Square, they actually have some trees in the back of, we're in the kind of garden area on the, do y'all know Chestnut Square? It's a historic village in McKinney. Y'all know where the old courthouse used to be, the one they tore down? It's the last courthouse. There's one on the square, but then there's one off the square that they tore down. And then there's Chestnut Square. They have a farmer's market, well-known farmer's market there. But there's some jujubes. Is that right? Actually, Bruce and I were meeting with them one day, and we were walking by and saw these jujubes. And at first, I didn't know what they were because I've never seen them. And then I figured out what they were. And I tried one. It was pretty good. So.
Packed with nutrition. What do they look like?
There's a picture. I have a picture later on. Sorry, I kind of got off on a tangent. Pistachios, that's probably not a good option either. That needs more of a Mediterranean climate. Obviously, they grow those in California. So we'll go through some of these later. So temperature is really important as far as fruit trees. So cold hardiness is important. So can that fruit tree survive our winters? So that's an average annual extreme minimum temperature. We've talked about that, right? The first day of class, went over cold hardness zones. We also have to have chilling requirements. That's the time between October and February where it's between 32 and 45 degrees. Now, some people say, well, it's just below 45. And so those fruit trees and nut trees need to accumulate a certain amount of chill hours in order to properly flower and leaf out at the right time. So cold hardiness, the newer maps I don't like because it's harder to see the colors. You probably can't see it, but there's multiple colors here. But we're 8A, so we get 10 to 15 degrees. So really 10 is what we see around here. In the last 10 years, we've seen 10 quite frequently. So that's something to consider. As far as change in the zone here, I have this kind of blown up, because what we see with this weather data is that you have this heat island effect from the Metroplex. When you put so much concrete and structures and stuff together, that retains a lot of the heat overnight, and then releases that heat overnight, and so you kind of have a microclimate, so to speak. So we see that. The USDA and the Arbor Day Foundation had changed their cold hardiness zones around the country associated with climate change. I will say that it still gets to 10 degrees here, and that hasn't changed. So I think sometimes people get excited about things, and maybe there's nothing to it. So it's been 10 degrees for a long time. So plan on that, and that limits us. So some of our fruit trees that we can grow may be damaged during a year where we get down to 10 degrees. But it may die down to the ground, but it could come back up depending on and we'll get into that a little later. Chilling requirements are a little more complicated, and unfortunately we don't have a weather, we have a weather station here, but I haven't analyzed the data to provide chilling hours that we accumulate each year. One of the only weather station in Texas, or North Texas, I'm aware of is over in Overton, which is more East Texas. It's not a good example of here, but they actually calculate and report chill hours each year on their weather station. And it can vary year to year, as you can imagine. So when we select fruit trees, we want to select fruit trees that match our chilling hours for our region. And so these fruit trees require a certain number of chill hours between 32 and 45 between these dates to start normal growth in the spring. And so in Texas, we range from 100 hours to more than 1,000 hours. So that's a big range. It's a big state, and it does, from north to south, that's a long distance. It's 800-900 miles, I think. And so we range from 900 to 1,000 here, all the way to 100 down here at Brownsville. And so, like usual, our county split between this 900 to 1,000 hour zone and the 800. So when you purchase fruit trees, try to buy one in probably the 700 to 800 hour range for most of y'all. That's what I would choose. And that's really important. And sadly, if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's, and I shouldn't have mentioned those names, big box stores. If you go to the big box stores, they don't always have the right varieties for our area because they're selling these to all their big box stores. So be careful. Now, I have gone to some of those stores this past spring and looked at the varieties now. Some of the varieties are okay, but not all of them. And honestly, while we're talking about that, a lot of the people who buy these, the plants are kind of really on the bigger side of what you would want to plant. And oftentimes people just go and plant that. They don't know about the pruning systems that we have in place for these plants, and they never do any pruning. And that's probably one of our most common problems. People don't know what to do when they plant it. And we'll go over that today on what you're supposed to do as far as pruning once you plant. So what happens if we plant the wrong variety that has the wrong chill hours? Well, the bottom line is you're really unlikely to get fruit set in the spring. It's gonna bloom too early, and then those flowers are gonna freeze and kill the fruit. So do you see any Bradford pears that set fruit generally? Do you ever see them set fruit? Do they typically bloom way before our last freeze? Yeah, that's why they don't set any fruit, because they get their chill hours really quick, they bloom too early, they don't have to set fruit. So that's something to keep in mind. That's just a good example of something that doesn't have a chill hours to match our region. But because it's an ornamental, we don't care whether it sets fruit. Basically, that's what that was. Loquats. I'm not that familiar with loquats, so.
I use them for ornamental trees in the landscape.
Okay.
I don't think they set fruit here.
That's very possible. Yeah, I believe that was on the list of possibilities, but it's probably further south that those can be grown. I have a colleague, I know that this will come up because I have a picture in here, but kiwi. So you wouldn't think we could grow kiwi, but one of my colleagues is actually working on his doctorate degree studying kiwi, the potential for kiwi production here in Texas. So that's pretty neat. And it kind of all started from work that was done in Nacogdoches at Stephen F. Austin, where they were looking at kiwi production. So. Okay, I think I said pretty much all what was on here. Here's another example of the cold hardiness zones, and this was the older version. So this says 7B right there in the northern Collin County. So that says it can get to 5 degrees. Rainfall. So rainfall is good, obviously, but too much rain is bad. Humidity levels are also important with fruit production because high humidity levels, frequent rainfall, those all contribute to diseases. And so when we have more frequent days of rain, leaf wetness, high humidity, we're going to see more diseases. And we can supplement with irrigation when we don't have rainfall. Water quality is important. High humidity levels in East and Central Texas can increase disease pressure. So here's a photo of our rainfall. We fall on kind of the 35 to 40 inch range here. How much rainfall do you think we've gotten this year? Anybody? How much? 31 inches. Oh, is that what the official?
Well, that's what was on TV, about 31 inches.
That's much lower than I thought. So my rain gauge says like 58 inches, my digital rain gauge. And I don't know that I've had it up the whole year. So I've noticed that the rainfall estimates vary greatly this year, and I've gotten much more than what the Weather Service says. I don't know about y'all, but like I'll get 4 inches of rain in a rain period, and then they'll say they only got an inch. It's like, whoa, that's a big difference. So
Aren't they just taking it like at DFW or whatever?
typically, yeah. So McKinney Airport, it's official station, and then DFW's, mostly it's the airports. Sometimes they'll factor in like weather stations that are provided by the local media, but normally it's those official sites. So that's pretty limited. Now, they do have radar estimates, which admittedly they say are not very accurate, but they do give you kind of a sense of differences, but they underestimate the amount of rainfall. So I like to show this also. So when we think about providing rainfall or providing irrigation and quality water, rainwater harvesting is a good option. So when we compare these are pretty much the same. And so this tells you the average annual runoff in thousands of gallons from a 2,000 square foot roof, which is not that big. 2,000 square foot, it's just probably part of an average sized roof area. Yes?
I just put a 500-gallon tank next to my barn, and it's almost full.
How many rain? Just probably one rain event? Two rain events?
I mean, we've had a ton of rain down in our area.
Yep. So, these tanks, we have like 2,400 gallons of capacity up here at the park. And, the roof is obviously large, but we're only using 2 downspouts up there. Y'all remember seeing that system we have up there? But in a like 1-inch rain event, we can fill those tanks. So it's a lot of water. And so if you're thinking about gardening or having a fruit orchard, this is a good option. Saves you money because you're not having to pay for that water. If you have limitations on the availability of water, this is a great option too. So what this says is right here in Collin County, you can capture 40,000 gallons of rain off of a 2,000 square foot area in a year's time on average. 40,000 gallons, that's a lot of water. And that's only 2,000 square foot. So let's say that big barn up there, if we had rainwater harvesting tanks around the entire perimeter of that barn, we could capture a lot of water. So I'll show this. This is a relatively old map. Whoops. Okay. But it shows relative humidity levels. So at 6 a.m., this darker portion over here has a higher level of humidity. And that's pretty much why I showed this. So that just shows that when we move our fruit production out to the west, and we've seen some of that, pecan production as well as grape production has moved out to the West Texas near Lubbock. And because our lower humidity levels out there, we're able to produce these without a lot of pesticides to control disease. So producers are more successful. Now, conversely, they're having to irrigate a lot more because there's not as much rainfall. So if we go back to this, so we're looking out here in the Lubbock area, 15 to 20 inches. That's if you're lucky. I know when I worked right over here, I worked right here at my last job, and the people there would refer to the area as the Great American Desert because they're seeing less and less rainfall on average. And when you get 1/10 of an inch and you get super excited, here it's like a drop in the bucket and it's like, oh man, I wish we would have got more. But there they get really excited and they can utilize that. They get excited because they can do a lot with 1/10 of an inch. So, but you got to grow crops, especially if it's dry land. You got to grow crops that can sustain itself with 1/10 of an inch. Okay. Tools for pruning. There's lots of tools here. I'll say your lopper is the most commonly used tool for a fruit tree and pretty much all you probably need to do most of the work. You'll pull out a saw sometimes for those big limbs. But if you're doing it frequent enough, all you'll need is a lopper. Chainsaw typically is making that horizontal pruning cut at the base of the tree. After about 10 years' time, depending on what you're growing. It's a good time to bring that up is a lot of our fruit trees, peaches, plums, nectarines, apples, etc. A lot of those are not going to live very long. They're short-lived. And oftentimes we get clients that call the office, email, send pictures, etc. And it's just an old tree and it's dying, and that's just typical. They're not gonna live that long here. And as I probably mentioned at a previous class, is that people have kind of a emotional attachment to their plants. And so sometimes they don't like to hear that the joke about making a pruning cut at the base of the tree. They don't laugh when you say that. So don't ever say that, please. So it's important for them to understand that that's because of our climate, because of disease and insect pressure, just the challenges of growing those trees, they're not going to live that long. So this picture is just to show that each tool kind of has certain size branches or a purpose. So you don't want to use these hand pruners on things that are just really too large for it. You're going to damage the tool or your hand because you may pull a muscle in your hand. So use the right tool for the right size limb. Hopefully you've seen this before with Steve Hauser's presentation, the 3-cut. Y'all remember that? Okay. Anybody not remember that? Who wants to admit it? So 3 cuts. First cut is the undercut. That's so when you cut this branch off here, it doesn't strip all the way down the side of the tree. And then the last cut is the right there at the collar of that branch. And if you recall, one reason to make that cut right there, not make it flush on the side, is that this area is naturally there to wall off pathogens from entering. So if we make it flush cut, immediately that area of the trunk will wall off and protect the rest of the tree from invasion from pathogens. Did Steve mention that, didn't he? So if you cut down through here, you're gonna increase your chances of infection. So the effects of pruning on growth. And when we start training a young tree, this becomes more important to understand what effects you might have on that tree. And so if we cut right here, and keep in mind this is alternate leaf arrangement, which is in pretty much most cases. When we make a cut right there, it's going to cause these buds down here to force growth. So when we make cuts, it's important to know the effects of those cuts. So when you're trying to when you're trying to train that tree to grow in a certain way, that's important. Now, if it's opposite leaf arrangement, if we cut this off, this apical bud, you're going to force these lateral buds to break. I can't think of any fruit tree that's opposite, though. That's more of a rarity in plants. So when you go to try to identify a plant and you look at it, is it alternate or opposite? If it's opposite, that narrows the list down greatly, very quickly. It's easier to identify. That doesn't mean there's still not a lot of plants out there, but it's a lot smaller number. We'll take a break here in a minute. So there are lots of different pruning and training methods, and we'll kind of go over some of these. I'll reserve our grape pruning and varieties and information on grapes to Michael. So he'll talk about this afternoon. And he'll give us probably a few hours of lecture, and then we're gonna take a little field trip up to the vineyard, the research vineyard, and talk about that some more. Y'all probably already saw it when we did the tour, but Michael wasn't here when we gave that tour, so he'll be able to provide some more information about training, pruning, trellises, the varieties that we're looking at, et cetera. So there's different methods. So we have an open center method here, central leader. We have a vineyard where you're trellising, and leave it to the viticulturalists, the vintners, the winemakers, who for thousands of years have grown grapes, to come up with elaborate systems, probably some of the most elaborate systems in growing grapes. So that's why Michael's talking for 3 hours this afternoon on just one crop. Just shows you how much effort's been placed on that plant. And for those who like grapes, either table grapes, grape juice, or wine, which a lot of people do, right? How many people like those things? Hopefully all of you. So it is a little challenging to try to teach this type of thing in a lecture format. I wish we had a fruit orchard here, a full-blown fruit orchard where I could go out and show you how to prune these different plants, which we're trying to move in that direction, but it takes time. And so hopefully, we do have a few fruit crops here. We have grapes, we have blackberries, we have pomegranates, and we have figs. Obviously a limited number of some of those, but central leader, here's trying to show that. Here's a modified central leader where a cut is made midway up the tree here to force more growth outwards. When we talk about central leader, like for a pecan tree, we don't want to limit that upward growth. This would be more like for an apple tree. This would be a pecan tree. And as you can see in this photo, we're trying to space out those branching patterns. And before we get too far into this, I should mention, what is the purpose of these pruning systems? The purpose is essentially, there's several purposes. I probably have a slide that goes over these. Let's see, do I? No. So let's just go back and talk about the purpose. So sunlight penetration is a big component. That's probably a good quiz question. So sunlight penetration into the canopy of these trees is an important component of pruning systems. It's the same for grapes that are trellised, and vines, other vines and stuff. Another component is structural strength for fruit load management. So we want to prune these and train these plants in a certain way so that they have strong branching patterns, have strong scaffolds, as we call them, branches, that were able to hold the weight of that fruit. If anyone's ever owned a fruit tree of any sort, they realize that the weight of that fruit is substantial, and those branches need to be strong enough to hold that fruit up. Otherwise, you risk damage to the tree from breakage. So going back to that slide on photosynthesis, showing that sunlight, the leaves, you got to have sunlight penetrate the canopy sufficiently to hit the leaf surfaces so that the chlorophyll and the chloroplasts and all the those systems within the leaves can produce those sugars that go into the fruit. So if you let those plants just grow naturally, obviously they're going to produce fruit, but they're probably not going to produce it as efficiently, effectively, and as productively unless we prune them and train them. So that's the point. So open center, here's crops that you would use in open center. and then central leaders. So these are two main pruning systems that you'll see on a lot of different crops here. So a lot of these are stone fruits. Stone fruits or peaches, plums, nectarines, even apricots, almonds, those are all stone fruits. Why are they called stone fruit? Because basically that nut inside is kind of stony. That's how it gets its names. Almonds are actually a stone fruit too. It's just the seed inside that stone. So I know everyone can read this. This is on Aggie horticulture. It gives a good representation of one, spacing. So it talks about spacing between plants. So for apples, we're talking 10 to 14 feet for some of the dwarfed varieties, 20 to 25 feet between plants. Blackberries, 3 feet, just trying to give you all an idea. Peaches, 18 feet, pears, 25 feet. This talks about years for first fruit. So a lot of these, 5, 4, 3, 1, 2, 3. So, and that's just first fruit. That's not full-blown production. So, and in some of these cases, you don't want, you want to probably limit production the first few years for fruit trees so that it doesn't waste energy in producing fruit that's just not going to be very substantial. You'd rather put that energy into growing a tree. Talks about pollination requirements. A lot of this is probably in your book as well. So cross-pollination requirements. Some of these are self-pollinated. This talks about the pruning system requirements over here. Here's on propagation methods for the different crops. Grafting, etc. So I'm not going to spend much time on that. My colleagues and I are planning on doing a fruit tree propagation workshop next year, probably early next year. So hopefully y'all have an interest in that. So we'll probably have the class right here. We haven't set any dates or anything. Haven't planned it out yet, but we've been talking about it all year. So if y'all have an interest in that. So this is for our open center system. This would be the first year when you plant. You just plant the stick. So you cut all that branching off. And you make a horizontal cut 2 feet off the ground. So really no matter what size tree it is in the system, you want to make that cut. It's very critical. And then so basically that cut kind of sets the height of that trunk of that tree. And so that's the 2 foot basically here and here. So this is second, third year, and then this is years afterwards. And so that's why we do this. And then this is before we make any pruning cuts, so we'll want to thin some of this out. And then we get to this point and we basically maintain it at that shape. Yes? What keeps it from splitting? Well, we do want to have the proper branching angles so that you don't develop included bark. I think I've talked about that before. Hopefully Steve Hauser talked about that too. So, but what you do, and there's a better picture here. So we cut it here that first year, and that sets the height. What keeps these from breaking? Well, you kind of build those up over the years to where they have substantial strength to hold the weight. You're reducing fruit production each year by pruning. So you prune off a certain amount of fruit. You also thin. So those are all things that help give those, we call these scaffolds. So these branches that come off the main trunk, we call those scaffolds. you want 4 to 5 scaffolds per tree. And you want them kind of equidistant apart, although oftentimes you don't really get to determine that. It's just trying to select the ones that you. So if we go back over here, this second and third year is where we're trying to pick those. So when we make this cut here, then we get branches that come off like this, and we want to try to select the right ones and possibly train those to grow in certain directions. So this is a good example. So this sentence here is an important concept. Stone fruits produce flowers on 1-year growth or 1-year-old wood. So the leaves of 1-year-old growth would grow throughout the tree. So leave 1-year-old wood throughout the. So these little pencil-sized or a little bit larger than pencils, you see all those little branches? Those are all going to flower. Let's see. I don't have a picture of it in flower right here, but so all those little flowers, all those little flowers potentially will set fruit, and so you can imagine kind of the production that may from this one tree. So we want to top the tree. So we talk about not topping crepe myrtles. Well, crepe myrtles are ornamental. So this is fruit tree. So we top it, and what determines the height of topping it? Well, for taller people like myself, it's how far you can hold the loppers up. And so the length of that lopper here is how I determine the height. So, shorter people may want to get some help, or they may want to just have a shorter tree. Just a second, let me finish that concept. So why is that? So that you don't have to use a ladder to harvest the fruit. So you can pick the tree by standing on the ground. Yes?
I just wanted to make sure, when are you doing this pruning? Is it right after?
Best time to prune is during the dormant season. And if you don't have that many trees, to do it right at bud break. So right at bud break, so that's when it's flowering. So if you think about that, why is that the best time? Well, you can see all the flowers on the tree, and then you know what you're pruning off. The other idea is that at bud break, all that nutrients is coming up to the top of the tree during that time, and it's going to heal the wounds that you make faster, rather than making it early in the dormant season, and then those wounds kind of sit there for a lot longer time. If you have a large orchard, which in college we had 1,500 trees, and so we couldn't wait till the last minute to prune. We needed to be pruning throughout the winter in order to get through all the trees in sufficient time. So the typical question I get from students is, why is that white? That's whitewashed. It's a method to try to reduce the chance of sun scald, which is a very common problem on fruit trees. Sun scald is, the heating up of that bark and tissue that can be so hot that it kills it, and then insects are attracted to that and end up invading the wood, particularly wood borers. Typically, you'll find sun scald on these scaffolds right at this point. And so you can imagine that if we leave some of these branches here when we're pruning, we're going to shade those scaffolds, those parts of the tree so that they don't get sun scald. So leave a few branches in here inside this vase, because it's kind of like a vase. So if we look down on the tree, it's going to be open in the center. That's where it gets its name. That allows the sun to penetrate the canopy in the center and you have more equal sunlight penetration. That's the point. So these are all kind of coming out from the center, all these scaffolds, and then so oftentimes when I prune fruit trees, I kind of get inside the open center, and then I kind of go around and trim it up to where the light can come down in. But you leave enough of these branches in here to shade the scaffolds. And it's that west sunlight exposure, which is the hottest. And so let's say this is east over here, and this is east and this is west. That western sunlight is going to penetrate right here, and you're going to develop sun scald on these scaffolds. So that's where you want to leave those branches. So here's a commercial orchard. This is actually in Fredericksburg. So there's a lot of pick your own peaches or orchards in Fredericksburg and in East Texas as well. When the orchard in Nacogdoches that I worked at, it was a pick your own. So people would show up, we just give them a box or something to pick into. They go out and pick, come back, we'd wait, and then they'd pay and be on their own. So, but I'd also go pick and have boxes that people who didn't want to pick their own, they could cart off. So we also grew all sorts of vegetable crops, plums, nectarines, other things. So here, let's just go over some of this typical production system. A lot of growers will keep this just plant free underneath here, so they don't have any competing plants. I don't really agree with that. I don't think that's a good thing to leave this bare soil. This is going to dry this soil out. It's going to heat up. There's all sorts of negative things that outweigh that weed pressure. It's better to have that ground covered. The soil health is going to be diminished by not having plants on there. It'd be better if you had mulch around the bases of these trees. That's not always practical because in these systems you're managing labor costs. So labor cost of putting mulch out would be kind of the best thing for this is cover crops. So trying to have cover crops like legumes, clovers, are some of our best cover crops under orchards, both pecan orchards and fruit orchards. Those clovers or legumes, they're going to fix nitrogen. They're going to add nitrogen to the soil. They cover the soil. It's all good. You have both cool season legume cover crops. You have warm season legumes, so you could plant those to cover the soil. One study by the Noble Foundation in Ardmore, they actually tried to calculate the amount of nitrogen clovers put into the soil. They come up with 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre when you have a cover crop like that in there. So that's a significant amount. Obviously, that productivity or that nitrogen is dependent on the growth of those cover crops. So in this area, we have a drip system where they have emitters to irrigate the tree here. This is just a better shot of the scaffolds in the trunk. You can see some of those inner branches that were left to shade the scaffolds, how that's important. And this is if you have poor pruning technique, poor structure that you develop, and you let it fruit too heavy when it's too young. And so they put these sticks under here to try to hold up the scaffolds because they're weighted down. That was a bad decision. They should have thinned the tree substantially. So my secretary, Maureen, y'all might have met her. So she was growing a fruit tree. I wish I could replace this picture with her picture, but I always forget. But so she had a tree, probably not this bad, but she had significant fruit load on it. And we had a windstorm, and the tree actually split right down the middle into like 3 or 4 different sections. So it just split perfectly down the middle. So you have to think about that. It may not be sagging this heavy, but if we get a storm that starts blowing that around, that wood is not really strong like an oak tree. It's soft, and it's can break. So sure.
If you have a tree that looks like that,
Yes.
so obviously that trunk is not 2 feet off the ground or whatever, it's up there. Is there any way to correct it?
The trunk is 2 feet off the ground right here. You just can't see it. It's covered up, and the scaffolds come out like this. But they just left too much on here. They should have pruned it back probably here. This is probably, if I was to guess, probably in the 3rd growing season based on the size. And that's way too much fruit for that plant. So they shouldn't have even left that much fruit wood on there. So if we go back to this picture here, you got to limit that fruit wood on there, even if you have to trim it off at the trunk. So I got kind of carried away. Why don't we take a break? Okay, we need to get started, so start making your way back to your seat, please. Before we get back into this presentation, I'd like to remind you, encourage you, and I probably haven't done a great job in encouraging you to use the online training modules that are available to you. From what I've seen on the site, very few of you have actually logged in, unless I'm seeing the wrong thing. Very few of you have logged in and utilized this, because it does track your usage. So rather than getting a show of hands, I just encourage you to use it. There's a lot of good information on there, and you're going to lose access eventually to the site. So it's not something that you'll just have indefinitely access. Next year, they're going to, this is our free year to use it. Next year, they're going to start charging to use it. So that'll be, nobody's told me how long, when they'll cut access to it. If I was to guess, it'll be at the end of the calendar year. So, but nobody's mentioned that. We're part of a pilot testing group. So I think we're one of 6 counties pilot testing it. And, you know, I've been attending these planning meetings for this, and I think we're one of the few counties actually doing it. So your experience with this system, your utilization of this system is really important to the rest of the state. And so I really encourage you to participate. At the very minimum, at least go through some of the modules for general, because we're going to survey you on the usage of it. And so your feedback on how to use it, it can be as simple as the system sucks because I couldn't log in. I tried several times. I emailed y'all never responded. That's a valid criticism. They need to know that kind of feedback. So if y'all have had those problems, which I think some of you have. Yes? Great.
I learned a lot from it, and I don't think that it could be better coordinated with what we're going over at the time.
Yeah.
Because I think nuts and fruits and trees, you know, I'm really an expert at all that. It's like modular 5 or something.
Yeah.
So it's not really coordinated with what we're doing.
In class. Yeah.
I think that would be very beneficial.
Now as far as I know, you can take the modules whenever you want. So, and when we try to schedule the class, we do try to schedule it based on the sequence of the book. But unfortunately, our speakers aren't available when the chapter says they need to be available. So we have to, like turf grass management is I don't know when it is in the book, but it's one of our last lectures, unfortunately, and our lawns are typically dormant by then. So we would like to have it earlier, but it's kind of if you have it too early and we haven't talked about all the other basic things, it's kind of a bad time. And one reason why we scheduled turf grass management, because that's when our turf grass specialist was available, but then he betrayed us and left. So, yes. Yeah. There is a PDF in the Dropbox under miscellaneous, I think, and Marv updates that. And I don't know if the last 2 lectures since you were out of town were updated, so that's probably something still left to do, and I don't know if that's what you were miscellaneous.
Chapter church, it's not under miscellaneous.
Oh, okay.
The videos is its own line.
Oh, okay.
The box.
What folder on Dropbox is that PDF of the links to the videos?
It's in the top level class folder,
Top level class folder. Okay.
right under 2016 training class.
Okay.
Will those videos be up on YouTube indefinitely, or are you gonna take them down after?
Will those videos be up there indefinitely?
Last year's are still there. So
Yeah, last year's are still there, so we haven't taken those down.
On that module, I thought the information was really, really good, but the navigation of it a little bit, like if you didn't read the question, like was clicked.
Doing the
and I
quiz
clicked
afterwards?
The wrong thing, and then it won't let you go back and change your answer
Oh.
or whatever.
Okay.
So you're just like,
So we need to let them know that,
Yeah, I know some of our certified master gardeners have gone through some of the modules and had some corrections where there's actually some problems, or even if you find stuff that is not working, that's really critical too.
how do you get on? I've tried several times to get on. I've emailed the help desk, and I still haven't gotten
That's
an answer. Oh, great.
yeah. There might be a phone number you can call. I don't know. So if you cannot get on, send me an email, and then I'll try. Even though I'm pilot testing it, part of it is limiting my involvement in it, because that's really their thing. They need to be supporting that, and if I haven't seemed as responsive to or offering to do more, it's because I have a lot of other things I'm doing, and I'd rather them handle that portion of it. So I hate to be honest like that, but I've stretched myself really too thin this fall. But
So it's in the Dropbox under miscellaneous.
the videos.
Yes, it's videos.
No, I think that we posted the actual instructions on how to log in. Those are in Dropbox too, I think. So it's Learn Online is kind of the website. Learn Online at .agrilife or A&M or something. They're really good. It's I've tried a few of them, and it's not real intense. You go at your own pace. So if you want to go fast, you can. If you want to go slow, you can. How we utilized it in this class is essentially for supplemental. Yes.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, it does have that little thing.
Won't let you.
I was trying to click the advance, and it does kind of slow you down.
Oh.
Yeah. So, yes.
Could there be a link in Dropbox to help clarify some of the, I can't get on, not finding it, it doesn't
I think there's there's the instructions on Dropbox, I believe. So I'll put this in your evaluation, and I've asked them to put together an evaluation, and they still have not done that. So I'm thinking that I'm gonna have to create my own evaluation of this, and that shouldn't be my job. We'll do an overall evaluation of the class. How I've done it for the past 3 or 4 years is an online evaluation. And so after class is over, probably the day of the last class, I will send you a link where you click on the link and you fill out this online survey. We've had near 100% participation in the survey, but some of you may choose not to do that. In the past, we've done paper evaluations. In the past, we've had you fill out a survey at the end of every class. And that seems excessive. I hope y'all agree. Because I would end up with these stacks of paper, and then trying to utilize that data is just overwhelming. The nice thing about the online surveys, and I know we should be lecturing on something. The nice thing about the online surveys is the software analyzes all the data for me and provides me a report. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to enter in all those little things. So it really does help us. The feedback really helps us because we, as a committee, because we have a planning committee, we sit down and look at those evaluations. So it's not something that gets tossed away and we don't utilize. So we utilize it locally, and it's available to the agency to see that feedback. So it's really important. Okay, let's get back on the topic. So this is a great picture. I think I took this picture, and I think this is the orchard there in East Texas. I like the picture because it shows that, the flowers, hopefully you can see the flowers on the tree, you can see the flowers on what's trimmed off. So you can see that this was done at that time that I recommended, was at bud break. In a large orchard, they drop the limbs in the center, and they come through with a fork on a front end loader, and they pick up that material and then haul it to typically a burn pile, and they burn it. Why do you burn it? You could chip it, make mulch out of it, but when you're trying to manage diseases, you wouldn't want to utilize that mulch in the orchard because you're going to have potential diseases in that material. So from a sanitation standpoint, they're burning it, typically. Now, you could probably mulch it and then utilize it like in a garden or somewhere else. Okay, we're going to talk about the central leader. So this is where you have a tree, and then you're going to try to space out the branching among the tree. You're going to also have a single branch or main trunk of the tree. So this is trying to show you that there's certain portions where you're going to prune off. This is a great picture to show an apple tree that's been trained into that central leader. You can see that these branches are coming off at an unusual angle for this species of tree. Naturally, the tree wants to grow up and more parallel to that main trunk, which is a problem. That's why Bradford pears, you look out there, out the window to those Bradford pears, and look how parallel those branches are to each other. That's poor branching. It ends up with included bark, which causes that tree to split. So this is much better. It allows for sunlight penetration into the canopy at different angles. The branches are spaced out more evenly, and so that's part of that pruning and training system. So apples, pears, pecans, obviously, apples and pears are going to stay smaller trees, and you're going to manage that a little more intensely compared to a pecan. That pecan, you're going to kind of establish this branching, and then after a certain number of years, you're just going to let it grow on its own and not really do any pruning. In some cases, with apples and pears, you're going to need to force those scaffolds to grow out into a certain angle, and so you can actually put spacers in here to force that to grow. So having to be able to get those to grow out like that. And so what are those? These could be like PVC pipe, small PVC pipe with a insulated wire running through it. That could be an option. That's what I would make on my own. There could be other things that are available. That insulated wire you could wrap around, each portion to keep it to grow out like that. This is just showing all the different cuts you might make to kind of thin this out and get it to grow like you want it. Does anyone want to pronounce this? I have a hard time pronouncing this word. Espalier? Okay. Y'all heard it. So this is a very, I wouldn't say common, but for thousands of years they've been growing fruit trees in this manner. And you can come up with these elaborate designs. But from what I understand, one reason for having the branch come down like this is it tricks the young tree into producing fruit earlier. So when you have something that's intensely pruned and trained, you can get fruit production earlier. So let's talk about berries. So generally we grow them in a compact hedgerow. In some cases we're going to trellis those plants. So here's kind of a trellis system that this is at the Noble Foundation in Ardmore, Oklahoma. So they have lots of demonstrations there at that facility. So they have two T-posts in kind of a V shape and then a wire running on each side. And that kind of keeps those canes, as we call them, erect. So they're not falling over on the ground. When they're falling over, they're more prone to disease, insects. This keeps them upright, allows airflow better. It helps with sunlight penetration as well. So blackberries and raspberries you can grow like this. Okay, so there's actually a kind of a greenhouse structure over the top. This is just for demonstration at the site, but you could do this as well. Actually, one of our fruit specialists is starting to grow even fruit trees inside a hoop house. This is probably more for weather protection. They're obviously going to irrigate this because this is going to not allow any rainfall underneath that structure, but it's going to protect it from like hail damage, which is actually a real concern every year, as many of us unfortunately know, especially if you live in Wiley. So, and as a producer, hail every year can affect production of all sorts of crops. So that's not the primary focus of these photos, though. But this shows they have several different varieties and types there. So this is a raspberry. So this is obviously a raised bed too, so they're improving the soil. If you're wondering what the edging is down here, this is somewhat unique. Probably not something I would use, but the horticulturalist, Steve Upson, who's there, another Steve in horticulture. There's endless numbers of Steves. This is actually retreads or tire treads. So, there's just little sections of tires, and I guess they're stapled in there somehow. But it's not something I would use. Ardmore, Oklahoma. It's right up 35, off of 35. I think I mentioned the Noble Foundation before. I might try. Yeah. I don't. The only person I know growing them, unless some of y'all are, is Dr. What's his name? He's a veterinarian. He lives over near New Hope, and he started growing raspberries, blackberries, and all sorts of fruit. And he's been quite successful. And we have limited raspberry varieties that we recommend, but he started trying lots of different varieties with quite a bit of success.
Are they like blueberries, where blueberries don't do well here, but you have to do all raised beds or?
He does raised beds, yeah. He kind of followed our earth kind approach with compost and mulch, and so he's been successful with that. And he has trellises for the blackberries and raspberries. And his thing with water was quite a unique story. He probably has about five acres or more, and maybe 10 acres. But he really didn't want to pay for water from the city, as you can imagine. That can get pretty expensive and eat into your profits. So he decided to put in a pond. Well, ponds really, there's certain places you can put ponds, and you can do you can drill these deep soil samples to see if you have the soil and underlying structure to support a pond. Well, he didn't really do that. He knew a guy who owed him, and he was going to do the bulldozer work, so they started bulldozing and kind of put in a small pond, and they realized it wouldn't hold any water. And it was like, oh no, he did all this work and then it won't hold any water. Well, if he'd done the soil test, he would have known that. So he said, well, let's just go deeper. So then they brought in a backhoe and started going deeper. And I'm not trying to make him look bad. I'm just telling a story so you may learn from his experience. He went so deep, he went under the bedrock. Now he has this aqua color, quarry. And actually there is a quarry across the road from him, but so he basically put in a quarry, really deep, and has fish and stuff and is able to pump water out of there. So he kind of probably did more than what most would. We do have a quarry not too far from here. It's actually the site of a flower farm. Quarry, it's called Quarry Flower Farm. Right, Diane? Is that the name of it? It's right up by where Diane lives. And is it up Custer Road? Is that?
Custer Road first to the right, and it's on 127.
127. So it's, let me try to remember her name. Does anyone remember the name of the person? Cynthia Alexander. And so she's like a one-woman workhorse out there and manages the place by herself. But you might go out there sometime when maybe they have an open house. We've had events out there, but the quarry is quite unique looking. So it's very deep. I believe she does pump water out of the quarry as well. I think it's a gravel quarry, so it's where they're getting gravel for the roads and stuff. So here's a commercial blackberry production. It's quite a tall hedge. That's quite impressive. This is I don't know how they get it to 10 to 12 foot tall. But they have posts and wire and stuff in here. So fruit thinning is important for some of the crops. So for peaches, nectarines, we're 4 to 6 inches apart. So this won't work. That's way too much. So you're going to want to thin this out. And you don't really want to wait till they're that big to thin. You want to thin when they're small, so you don't waste a lot of energy. Apples, 1 to 2 fruits per cluster. Plums, 2 to 3 inches apart. Persimmons, 1 fruit per shoot. And then most of the other ones don't require thinning. I already mentioned pecans. For most homeowners, thinning pecans is not going to work. But in a commercial orchard where they have equipment, they'll have that option. So let's talk about planting. Yes?
Back on your chart where you had the different trees and what the methodology for the pruning was.
Yes.
For citrus trees, it just said maintenance. So can you talk about
Okay,
how
pruning.
you prune for, like, we have Myers lemon trees and we've got a mandarin orange tree in a pot.
Okay.
And so I haven't had any coaching on pruning.
I would say it'd be a modified central leader where you're kind of topping a branch, to where it doesn't get too tall or too upright that fills out. So it's not open center or anything like that. Actually, in commercial citrus groves, as they call them, the large ones, they actually use a mower. They have this big machine that has a mower on one side and over here, and it just drives down the row and just mows the top and the sides off. And they don't really do anything other than that. So if you've gone to Florida and go through those orchards when they're doing that, I used to work out there, so I'd see it, and it's really quite strange. From a horticulturalist, I wouldn't recommend it, but when you have thousands and thousands of acres of citrus, practically pruning by hand just is impractical. So. But from a disease standpoint, if you have diseases in there and you have this mower mowing, weird. So, I like this photo. This is from the Texas A&M Forest Service. So it just shows your hole. You needed the depth of the root ball, maybe slightly raised, and then you want to have a little ring around, particularly with mulch. You want to water it in. It needs to be twice as wide as the hole. Now this is on containerized trees. A lot of fruit trees are going to become bare rooted. So they're going to come in kind of a bundle in a cardboard box. And they're going to be bare root, there's no soil. Why is that? Well, shipping the soil costs extra money. So they can bundle them up like this and the fruit trees can handle it. So when you plant these bare rooted, you just really need the hole as big as the root system. You don't have to make it twice as wide. However, it's not going to hurt making a bigger hole so you loosen up this heavy clay soil so you don't have these slick sides on and the roots are able to penetrate that soil. You're going to want to soak the trees for an hour, these bare rooted trees, in a bucket. If you get a large bundle and you have a lot of trees to plant, you can actually, instead of doing this and you want like several weeks time frame, you can heel those in where you kind of dig a trench and you just kind of set them in this trench and then lightly pack the soil around them and water them in to keep those roots moist. So the ideal size is 3 to 4 foot. And so we're going to inspect each of these for problems. So, these nurseries, they want to maintain their reputation. They shouldn't be shipping this stuff, but if you have a tree with a problem, let them know. They'll typically replace those trees free of charge. So this has, oozing sap coming out of these holes. This is wood borer damage. This one has crown gall on it. This is probably more common. A lot of these fruit trees are grafted, so you want to inspect the graft union, make sure that it's healthy, it's not bad. Not sure. This would probably be the graft union right there on that plant. This is probably the graft union, so that they didn't probably use good sanitation when they grafted the plant. Have I talked about grafting and rootstocks and scions? Have I talked about that before? Okay, so it's probably not the best picture to have up there while we're talking about it, but fruit trees, very common to have a grafted plant. You have a rootstock, which is the lower part of the plant, and then you take a bud from another variety or even species of plant, and you graft it onto that rootstock plant. And so there's different types of budding, doing these bud grafting. There's even stem grafting. I'm no expert in these types of methods. But basically, the top part is the scion. You know, they have cars named after that. So there's scions, and then there's rootstocks. And so there's certain varieties. Normally when you buy a fruit tree, you're buying it based on the scion. So that's what the name is going to be called. But if you want to be successful, you're going to pick rootstocks that are adapted to our soil, and that's the big component. So there are rootstocks that are going to be more adapted to a heavy clay soil than, say, a sandy soil. There's going to have rootstocks that are more resistant to nematodes. Like on peaches, there's the Nemagard peach rootstock. So if you're in a sandy soil, that is definitely something you're going to want to use, because nematodes are going to be a problem on fruit trees or on peaches. Oops. Fell off again. So is that enough said? Okay. So you want to set the tree the same depth as it grew in the nursery, so it's fairly easy to tell where that point is. And this could be potentially one of the most common mistakes that's made. And it's better to plant it higher than lower. More commonly, people plant it too deep, and that's a real problem. There's been situations, particularly in a pecan orchard, where they planted, acres and acres of pecan trees too deep. And you would think, well, maybe the crown of that tree would rot. No, all the plants snapped off in a windstorm because they didn't develop the right structural strength in that stem, and so they all broke off. So there's a fairly large orchard that it's out by Salina that I was asked to come check out the site, and I was looking over the new plantings of lots of fruit trees and pecans. All of them were planted too deep. I'm like, you really want to consider going back and digging all those up and resetting them, because there were several inches too deep. You could tell that was not the right location. So then the Extension Service recommends that you don't add any amendments or fertilizer and use the same native soil when you go back in that hole. Yes. For this, that's what we recommend. And I say it in the manner that I do because there's really been no research done by the Extension Service, at least here in Texas, of adding amendments. And so this is what they say. I would like to do some of this research. I think that amending the entire soil area would be really beneficial. It's our earth kind system. I think there needs to be work in this area. We did do it with the grapes. We amended a 6-foot swath with compost before we planted the grapes. I think we're seeing huge benefits from that. I think that could also benefit our trees. It's just right now, the overarching recommendation is no amendments in the whole. Why? What's the logic behind that? It's if you amend just that soil in the hole, the idea is that the roots won't want to leave. They'll want to stay in that hole. It's also with the containerized trees, you don't want to just dig your hole, plop it in there, cover it back up. You really want to break up that root ball and loosen it up. So you're not just, that's really the case with any containerized plant. You want to break up that root ball because typically there's circling roots already. There's roots that are formed up against the inner or outer layer of that root ball. So you want to break that up so those roots will want to go out into that soil. So then we plant a stick. So we cut the tree back. This is 18 to 24 inches from the soil surface, and then you cut off all the branches. So you just merely plant a stick. So that's really hard for people to do, right? They're like, what? I paid good money for that. So, but if you know what your goal is and you know how to properly prune and train these trees, you know the purpose of that. Now sometimes on some of our fruit trees we can have this sloughing bark. This isn't a bad thing. This is just that the girth of the tree is growing quickly, and so the bark's just kind of cracking off. Do you have a question? Okay, so I don't know if y'all heard any of that, but so she's asking about buying, a bigger tree, and should she still cut that off at that point? Is it better to have a larger girth than the smaller? If she's having to cut that off, shouldn't she just buy her smaller tree? Well, all great questions. Typically, you want to buy a fruit tree that's probably about 2 years old. So it's been at the nursery probably about 2 years. It's pretty thin. I know that at the big box stores, they're probably a little older than that, and they have a pretty stout stem already. My general rule of thumb with any tree, landscape trees, etc., is the smaller the better. And normally 2-3 years old is probably ideal. They get established quicker. If based on some research done by the Forest Service, they actually catch up to those bald and burlap trees that are much larger. So in the landscape, that's one thing that we say. So it's better to buy a smaller tree. They're cheaper. They're easier to plant. There's all sorts of benefits. Now, people like instant gratification, so they buy these big bald and burlap trees and spend hundreds and thousands of dollars on them. And I can understand wanting to do that, but it's a safer bet to buy the smaller tree. So. And that's the same for fruit trees, buy the smaller ones. These aren't very big. They are just little sticks and with little roots on them. So, but yeah, one thing that probably should have been said at the beginning, and I know it says it in your book, is you got to have some patience with the fruit trees. So. Let's see. So we're getting into varieties, and this can be somewhat tedious. So we'll go through some of this. This is based on Aggie Horticulture's website, so there may be some updates to some of this. Our fruit specialists have been doing a good job with coming up with new extension publications on various fruits. So if you go to Aggie Horticulture, click on the fruit link. There's great publications on each of the different fruit crops that can be grown here in Texas. So encourage you to read those. When you're working our information center or working the information booth, you're going to get questions like that. I want to grow pomegranates. You know what? We have a great extension publication. Here's the website where you can download it and read it, and it goes through everything in a very logical format, talks about varieties. And so I encourage you to do that as well. Check out those resources to learn more. Obviously, I use my disclaimer at the very beginning. I'm not an expert, so to go through and talk about each of these varieties, I just can't do that. Our fruit specialists can. So one thing you'll notice is that for particular crops, they break up the state of Texas into different zones. So a lot of this is based on climate. Some of it's based on soil, but certainly we don't have the same soil as East Texas or even West Texas. So this is more based on climate here. So I have some photos of some particularly well-known varieties, good varieties. Harvester is a good variety. Majestic. And this is a good photo to show that there's stone fruit. You have freestone peaches and you have clean peaches, and these are different varieties. So this would be a clean, to where the meat of the peach basically sticks to the pit, or you can have freestone where it falls away very easily. So freestone obviously is more desirable, but the thing about peaches is there's different varieties. They mature at different rates. So if you have an orchard and you want to have season-long peaches, you have multiple varieties that mature at different rates. Like June Gold is one of the earliest varieties that'll be ready kind of the first part of June, depending on the climate. And then you'll have other varieties, and generally the later the variety, the better it is, because it's on the tree longer, it ripens longer, and it's probably going to taste better. We also have yellow meated, and then we have white meated peaches. The white ones have a different flavor. They're quite, I think they're quite good. So, Redskin's a popular variety. So this goes back to the fruit trees. They tend to bloom in the early spring, and then if we have a late freeze, even if you have the right chill hours, you can still have those late freezes and lose the crop. So there are situations where you can try to avoid the effects of those late freezes. One way is to plant on top of a hill instead of at the bottom of a hill. And you may not be able to control that unless you have a lot of property. Like here at the park, we don't want to plant them down by the lake or by the creek. We want to plant them on top of the hill, because cold air sinks during these freeze events, and so things are more likely to freeze at lower elevations. So the cold air is denser and it's going to sink compared to the warmer air. And when you're talking about a 2 to 3 degree difference, that can make the difference between losing a crop or not. So that's the case with grapes, peaches, any of these things that may not even flower early, but they send out shoots that have buds that have flowers on them or contained in them. They may not have flowered yet, but those can be damaged. Those shoots can be damaged, and you lose a crop. So Michael this afternoon will probably talk about the fact that grapes have these tertiary buds where they have multiple buds contained within one. And so if the primary bud, which is the first one to come out, if that gets damaged by a freeze, then the other buds contained within that will be forced, and you can still the plant won't die, but you're gonna potentially lose most of your productivity because those additional buds don't have as much fruit or any fruit. So something to consider. I already talked about thinning, but it does increase size of the fruit, keeps the tree from breaking. As I mentioned earlier, one tree can produce 3 to 4 boxes. So you may not need very many trees, but you may need some as pollinators. You want good sanitation. During our plant pathology talk, one of the examples was brown rot of peach. And do you remember those peach mummies? We don't want to leave those peach mummies, those mummified peach pits that contain the fungus that will then sporulate and infect the tree the next spring. So we want to keep the floor of the orchard clean. Stink bugs and other insects can cause damage. We call this cat facing on fruit, and that's caused by these stink bugs. Or leaf-footed bugs. There's other insects too that can cause that. So is that edible? Yeah, it's still edible, but it's not very appealing. Bird netting is a good option. So if you have a problem, and I know some of our vineyards are starting to put bird netting over their vineyards. It's labor intensive, it's a chore, but it can be worth doing to prevent damage by birds. One of y'all said during class, during the break, that had problems with animals. So raccoons, possums, particularly raccoons can be a problem. And so traps are a good option. Nectarines, plums, jujubes. Is that how you say it? Or jujubes. It sounds the same to me as I originally pronounced it. Yeah, I like those kids. It's a cool name. I like it. I'm still learning how to pronounce it. But okay, so here's a bunch of varieties and different names. I forgot to upload to Dropbox. I put together a very narrow list of plants. So I went through and looked at all the zones and all the recommended varieties and narrowed it down to one list, one pager. So I'll upload that to Dropbox if you just want those 1, 2, 3, 4 varieties that are recommended for our area. And each spring I do a fruit gardening class, at least I have for the past few years for the city of McKinney and city of Allen. So I typically give a talk to the public about this. And we get good attendance, typically 50 people or so. I don't know if any of y'all have attended those talks, but the plums, Morris plum is the recommended variety. Apricots, apples. As far as quality of apples, it's not that great in Texas because we have a hot summer. So we really can't compete with quality for other climates like Washington and the Northeast and stuff that have cooler nights. There is rootstocks that can dwarf, and so you can create these espalier. Is that how you say it? Yeah, it's a French word, I imagine, right? I'm probably just butchering the word. Sorry, I don't have the voice for different languages. So this is interesting. So growing fruit trees in containers. And so I don't know how successful you would be with this, but there are methods such as this, and then here's another method where you're trellising and training these apple trees or any type of fruit tree. And so you're more intensely managing them. But this was at the Iowa State University Research Farm. They have a great, at Ames, Iowa, they have a great research farm looking at lots of different fruit. And their data suggests that they get higher yields per acre utilizing this system where they're training and pruning and managing it. So, interesting. Here's a freestanding dwarf variety. Pears, we can grow pears, but they fire blight, which I mentioned during our plant pathology talk, is their number one problem, especially in the spring months when we have more rain. It's more prevalent. There's several different varieties, and as I mentioned, I'm no expert on these varieties, but here's some photos for grins. Asian pears. Berries, so blackberries, blueberries, raspberries. Can we grow blueberries? I really hadn't talked much about that. We can. Here, I'll save that comment for a second. So blackberries are really do well around here. They produce lots of fruit, have few pest problems. We have thorny varieties or thorned. I don't really like the word thorny. Thorned with an ED instead of a Y, but the University of Arkansas has had a great breeding program, a very good breeding program on blackberries. So they have varieties, and typically they're named after Indian tribes. And so they have thorn varieties and then thornless. I would recommend trying to go with the thornless because the blackberry thorns are worse than most thorns, and they have a curve in them. So once they get a hold of you, they don't let go, and they can do some damage. So when you're trying to prune blackberries, that can be challenging. So planting, you can plant them by root cuttings. If you've ever grown blackberries, you can know that you'll end up with not just one, but a whole patch, because they kind of spread by root or underground stems. And so you can cut these up into sections and then have a trench that you plant them in. And then irrigate and they grow a new plant. So pretty easy to propagate by those. And then they are a biennial plant. So that means they grow 2 years. So what happens is they grow a top or a primocane the first year, and then it fruits the second year. So those canes that were primocane the first year become a floricane the second year, and they flower and then produce fruit. So one year, I'll make fun of my wife. She was helping me in the garden, and she was pruning. She really likes our blackberry bushes or vines or whatever you want to call them, and she just pruned them all down to the ground. I was like, no, that's not what you do. And so we didn't have any production that year. So you got to leave the primocanes from last year so that they'll flower and then produce the fruit. So, and then when those floricanes, after they're done, they'll go dormant this time of year or in the winter. They won't go dormant. They'll die. They'll turn a gray color, and those are the ones you prune out. So when you have thorns on all these canes, imagine trying to get in there and prune out certain stems that are dead. That makes it challenging to grow these. So if you can get ones without thorns, that's a big plus. I think they're thornless. Pretty sure they're thornless, the ones we have here. I have both a thornless and a thorned variety at home, and I'm thinking this year I'm gonna try to dig up the thorned varieties and just get rid of it, because it's just really, really bad. So is it worth the fruit? Yes, it is. If you have a thorned variety, it's worth it. I really like the fruit. So.
Do they make more? I've heard them say the thorns make more fruit. Is that true or not?
I have not heard that. I imagine that some people may say the fruit is better on the thorn variety, but I think they're just trying to justify keeping them. But I would imagine it's not worth, if you're having to get in there with your hands and prune that. So what are some options if you don't want to do that? To prune out those dead canes, you can just let it grow as a big thing, this big thing that just gets massive over time, and harvest for several years, come in with a big mower, tractor, and just mow the thing down. And then you lose a year of production, but then you clean it all up. So that's what we would do out in East Texas, is just, we'd have this big bramble, I guess is what they call it, this big thing of blackberries. You'd harvest off the edges, and that birds can eat the ones inside. And then after a few years, just take the big mower and just mow over the top of it. So this is our number one problem, is iron chlorosis. So if you've grown blackberries, you're gonna probably experience this. So because we have that high pH soil, we're gonna see that. Best thing you can do is just, utilize compost, add fertilizer as you can. You may try to use some of that, there's a product that's called ironite, and it's a foliar application. You can try to see if you can improve that nutrient deficiency by foliar applying it. Raspberries, Dorman Red is one variety. As I mentioned, one of our producers, still can't remember his name, but he's been trying several different varieties with success. Although that's not research, it is encouraging that you can try some of these other varieties that do well in other parts of the country, and they'll survive here. They do require more care than blackberries. Trellising is really a must, particularly to keep them off the ground for fruit quality. So here's a nice trellis raspberry. Persimmons, the Japanese varieties are really what you want to go with. The native varieties of persimmons are really not what people think of as quality persimmons.
Do the raspberries have the thorns that the blackberries?
I believe they do, yep. Figs, so figs grow as a bush. And so they are kind of marginal in this area. And so some varieties, we believe, have more cold tolerance, although there really hasn't been much research done on that in this area. I hope to do that with your support. With our research projects out here, it's always with y'all's support. And so if y'all have an interest in fruit trees and fruit variety testing, it's really something we ought to do. And we can do that here at the park. We just need time, energy, and resources and support from the park to do that. So we have some ideas on where to do that. It's just until it gains momentum, it's not going to ever happen. So yes. So with figs, pomegranates, and some other ones, you actually prune it into a bush, and you're just trying to follow that concept of sunlight penetration. There's really no open center, central leader thing. It's just trying to take out those interfering branches where they're kind of growing into each other.
Figs are in our neighborhood a lot. We've got an older neighborhood.
Yeah.
with a lot of figs.
Yeah, I have some in my neighborhood too. Celeste is a good variety, and again, we do have one thing I didn't mention is in Fredericksburg, we do have a research facility. It's called our Fruit Research Laboratory or Fruit Lab, I forget what they call it, but it's at the airport, just west of town. I don't know if many people go out to Fredericksburg, but I wouldn't say it's open to the public because I do have fencing around it, primarily keep the deer out of the place. But stop by and take a look. If you go during the week, they're probably open. But they're testing figs, pomegranates, and other types of fruit trees. They also have a research vineyard there too, testing lots of different grapes, particularly grapes that are resistant to Pierce's disease. And Michael might talk more about that. But there are different varieties of figs. This is one that's fairly popular. Figs can have problems with nematodes. Strawberries. So strawberries is an up-and-coming fruit in Texas. And thanks to one of our vegetable specialists, Russ Wallace, I received a grant for a number of years for testing, statewide testing of strawberries, particularly in hoop house structures, hoop house or high tunnels as he likes to call it. These are unheated, uncooled greenhouses. And so there's been support for this crop. I believe it's federal funding has helped support it. So part of the grant is getting cooperators in different regions of the state and testing these varieties and looking at it in a hoop house and outside a hoop house, and just trying to increase the marketability as well as production practices for this crop throughout the state because it has a lot of potential. This is a photo of how they do it in Florida. So Florida is a very large producer of strawberries. And they do the plastic culture. So this is sandy soil with these raised beds covered in plastic. And they do 2 rows on each side of the plastic. And that's pretty much how Russ is recommending growing this. He's been testing different plastics because that's not a very sustainable mulch. It's kind of funny, he was giving a presentation at our retreat about these mulches, and it sounded like testing these is a nightmare because some of them are supposed to be biodegradable, and they're really not, and they just end up just trashing the soil because you can't ever get all that stuff out of there. So they can be grown in the landscape, or raised beds, in your vegetable, grow them like a vegetable in your vegetable garden. Containers is a great place to use them too. Here's some recommended varieties, although I know Russ or Dr. Wallace, I've been testing a lot more varieties than this. Planting depth is critical. Typically, you buy strawberries as little transplants, often bare rooted, and so trying to get them planted at the right depth is very important. So here's the way to do it right here. So this is too high and this is too low. The one in the middle is the right depth. So you don't want these branches underneath the soil here. And you don't want your roots exposed. So there's that kind of happy medium where you don't have the roots exposed and you don't have the, stems underground too. So blueberries, I kind of started to talk about that and I caught myself. So blueberries are great. If you have a very low pH or acidic soil, they do prefer like a pH of 4 or 5. So that's very acidic. It's almost where you have a sandy soil that you're trying to acidify, which typically you're trying to make it more basic or alkaline. So here we cannot grow these in our soil. So if you try to grow them, they're just not going to do very well. They're better in a container. So you'll see even at our garden show or at local nurseries, they'll sell blueberries. But just keep them in a container. Don't ever plant them in the soil. Yes?
The rabbit eye varieties and such that are common around here, will they overwinter in a container, okay? Or when you grow them above ground, should you go with some of the...
It's a good question. The question was, will they overwinter in the container? I would probably try to play it safe and try to protect them during freeze events or put them in the garage or the barn or something like that. So. I don't have a lot of experience. Generally, we just say don't grow them here. But knowing that the nurseries are selling them, if you're going to try it, I would just try to play it safe. Assume that a lot of perennial plants, they assume that the root system's not going to get that cold. So I know there was an individual who planted them in the ground here recently, or in the area. And he planted them with peat moss and all this stuff. And I said, well, that might work for a little while, but that peat moss is going to start decomposing and those plants are going to sink down in the soil. So you can try to grow them in a raised bed with a mix like you would, say, an azalea. But there's very little work that's been done on that. So you can grow a fairly large plant in a very large container. So
There's a blueberry farm, it's called Blaze Family Farm in Rockwall. And
Okay.
They have a whole vineyard or whatever you call it, of blueberries.
orchard, I think, is
Orchard,
yeah.
And people go out there and pick them up.
Yeah, that's, rather than doing it yourself, let somebody else do it and just go out there. Yeah, it's not really economically viable. So there is one up, at least there used to be. I think they sold the place. I don't know if the new owners kept the blueberries, but it's Whitewright, I think is up. It's up just west of Sherman, near probably Pottsboro, south of Pottsboro, I think. Then there's out by Commerce. There's one, but I know there's a blueberry farm that was donated to the university and it turned it into a research farm. But I think they kept the blueberries. I got a 5-gallon bucket of them one year, so they're good. I know out in East Texas there are places, lots of places out there, and they have the soil for it. So there's kiwi. I don't know much about it besides this picture here, so I'll just say that my colleague's working on it, and so if he's doing a dissertation project on it, it must have some chance of success. Does it mean that we can grow them in North Texas? Probably not, but I don't know. So they do have male and female plants for the kiwi. Nuts. So here's some recommended varieties for different zones for nuts. Pecans are native to creeks and rivers around here. They do need good soil, so you don't want to plant them in bad soil. This is here at Myers Park. There's a large pecan tree over by the Baxter Dairy Farm, old Baxter Dairy, by our vegetable garden. So it's a nice tree. Although one of the roofs blew off and took out a huge limb this spring. There are lots of, probably if not thousands of different pecan varieties, and there are the Texas Pecan Growers Association is a great group of people that they meet annually, and one of their locations to meet is here in Frisco. And so every other year or every third year they meet in Frisco. I've been to the meetings. You might consider going. It's good education. They do kind of a short version of the pecan short course. It's kind of a day-long, half-a-day training program that's good. They have a trade show, and it's there at the Frisco Convention Center, so you might think of going to it. But I'd never been before, and so I went, and they have all these little plates set up with all these pecans, and they have kind of this pecan show contest. Suzanne probably knows all about this, so I thought that was pretty interesting. So I guess there's a taste testing or a visual. They judge them. So that's pretty cool. So Sue, I typically recommend this as the desirable as the variety for homeowners. So there are a couple things about pecans, and Suzanne probably laugh at me because I'm no expert. She probably knows more than I do. So you do have two different types of pecans. So typically when we plant an orchard or grove, however you say it, of pecans, you're going to have two different types. You want to have the two different types, and it has to do with when the varieties shed their pollen. And because these are wind pollinated, they're not insect pollinated, and so you got to have a type 1 and a type 2, and so typically for homeowners, having just pecans in the neighborhood is sufficient, and the pollen can travel a mile, and you can get production. But in an orchard situation, you don't want to leave that to chance, and so you want to plant the different types. So nitrogen fertilizer is important, water is important for production. Late season water is critical for nut filling. Satsuma oranges. So can we grow citrus up here? Yes, in a container and bring it inside. But satsumas do have more cold tolerance, but I think we're pretty marginal here. So keeping it in a container up here in North Texas is important so you can bring it in the winter. This is a Texas Superstar plant, so it's something that the Extension Service has wanted to encourage the nursery industry as well as gardeners to grow. So you might try this out. But you should also consider the fact that we have a lot of invasive and exotic diseases on citrus that we have to be concerned about, and we don't want to contribute to the spread of those diseases. So make sure you buy the plants from a reputable source and you don't transport these plants, particularly to South Texas, because they're under quarantine, so, or from South Texas either. So here's a photo of those jujubes. I'm glad I can be a source of humor. So I don't know if these are a good representation of the fruit, but quite interesting. Chinese date, I don't think they're related to dates that you find in the Middle East. I'm not sure, but pomegranates. So I like to spend a little bit of time, the last remaining minutes, talking about pomegranates, because I think that's an exciting crop for North Texas. I do have a box of some gnarly looking ones here if y'all want to come take a look at them. These were from our potager garden up here. And I know that's not the right way to say potager or something. So, but Joanne brought these in. So we have, I think, about 5 varieties up there of pomegranates. And it was obvious to us that one of the varieties did better than the others. And it's just kind of a demonstration. It's not really research. But it's Al Sinar, I think is the way you say it. And pomegranates, I believe, originally from kind of southeastern Russia, kind of the Crimea area, which has gotten had a war there recently. So, these become kind of popularized in the United States recently because of the noted health benefits from the fruit. So they do have some issues. Some varieties aren't as cold tolerant. We have lost a few varieties that we've been trying to test here, but I'm happy to report that we've had several varieties survive. So we'd like to continue and expand testing of the pomegranates.
What was the variety that you said did well?
Al Sinar. It's Al-SNIR-NIR. Ron, do you remember? Is that right, Joanne? So, as a homework to go home and look this up, we do have a great extension publication on pomegranates, and they actually talk about all these different varieties. And they are testing these down in Fredericksburg. And so I think it's an exciting crop for Texas. I don't know if this is the quality of fruit we can produce. I would say it's not very marketable. I think part of this is mechanical damage from wind. I think some of it's sun scald. But this variety that I was mentioning, Al Sinar, it seems like the quality of the fruit was much better than the other varieties. That's one. And the productivity of it was much better. But these plants are like in their 3rd or 4th year. Some of them, it's their 2nd year. So I don't know if y'all remember seeing those plants during the tour, but you can go check it out. The soil's been slightly amended. No, it's not in a raised bed. Nope. This is quite interesting. I don't know if y'all can see this, but there's all these little holes in it. And so you're wondering what caused that? Well, I happened to be looking at this a couple of weeks ago, and there's another branch that was actually poking right into it. And so it poked all these little holes in it. Because it's windy up there on the hill, it just continually poking throughout the entire season. So that's what caused that. So I don't know if you know much about pomegranates, but certainly part of the variety testing is looking at fruit quality. And so there's these little seeds in there, and they're kind of covered with the sweet substance that is kind of the juice, so to speak. That's why we like them. So you can make juice out of these. Some of them, the seeds are soft seeds so that you can just eat them, seed and all. And so those are, so some of these varieties fit into those two different groups. So some have hard seeds where you cannot really eat them. So you're gonna have to spit out all the seeds, or you're gonna have to create juice from it. So I think typically when you buy them at the store, they're gonna be soft enough to where you can just eat them. So, does anybody like pomegranates and eat them? And okay, great. Does anyone grow them? A few? Great. Well, I think this is pretty much, well, no, there's more slides. So I have a few slides on diseases and insects. I'll just run through this real quick. Some of this we've already talked about in the entomology and plant pathology section. So, pecans are native to Texas, but we do have quite a bit of insects that cause problems. Pecan weevil, we have other insects. This one's really cool, the hickory hornworm. We have some wood-boring insects too. Diseases, pecan scab being number one. Some other diseases. So this is the number one insect, in my opinion, and some others, for peaches, plums, nectarines. It's number one insect problem. So we have the adult weevil insect that bores a hole, plants or lays her egg in the young fruit here, and then the larva hatches and then eats through the center. So what you don't typically see this here. You'll see this kind of when you harvest, but in the young fruit, you'll see this clear jelly substance coming out of the fruit. We call that gummosis, but that's the fruit trying to heal itself from the wound created by the adult and the larva. So if you see those young fruit that have this kind of jelly, clear jelly stuff coming out, you might as well just thin that fruit out of there because it's not going to be edible. And might as well try to thin those out. But the infestation rate can be pretty high on these crops. So if you're not doing any sprays to try to prevent this problem, then you can just kind of hope that you don't have the larva in there. You can kind of see from this picture that larva actually encourages brown rot too, because it wounds that fruit and causes the fruit to rot as well. So not only do you have a larva, you have a rotten fruit as well. There are sprays. The thing about fruit trees, when we talk about insect and disease management, is being on a spray schedule. I think I already talked about all that in previous class. So you got to spray at a certain time of development in order to prevent these eggs from hatching and forming into larvae. So when we talk about wood borers on peaches, we have this wasp-like adult that lays an egg in the wood or bark and causes the larva to bore through the tree. So as I mentioned, we have fruit trees are fairly short-lived, so as the tree ages or is stressed, this attracts these insects into the orchard. May become a problem. Scale, and then you have dogs that'll eat your. Pretty good picture of the dog licking the fruit. So. Brown rot, we've talked about that. There's mummyberry. I like that name, mummyberry. So this is a mummified blueberry. You have other leaf spots. This is on blueberries. Then here's a bunch of websites. So that's the end of the presentation. It's lunchtime. So we'll start at 1 o'clock with Michael Cook and his presentation on viticulture.